Well, by tradition on Budget Week, we move at issue up a few days. Both Andrew and Chantal were in Ottawa today for Bill Morneau's first crack at budget making, and they're still there tonight. And so is Jennifer Ditchburn, the new editor-in-chief of the influential magazine Policy Options. Okay, let's quickly go once around on this. What's the headline on this budget? Andrew?
My guess is it's not quite what you voted for. It's not just that the deficits are larger, it's the composition. This was sold at the time of the election as we're going to run deficits because we're in a recession and it's going to be to invest in growth. Well, we're not in a recession, and only a small fraction of the spending, the $40 billion in new spending over 2 years, only a small fraction of it is actually even plausibly identifiable as investment or infrastructure. Most of it's for current consumption.
Chantal?
I think the opposite for many voters who voted Liberal. This is probably the kind of budget and the kind of spending that they expected, including the commitment to actually put some of the promises in place, even if that meant running a deficit.
Jennifer?
I'm thinking of this as the Sharpie and the eraser budget. So the Sharpie marker budget is let's make these big changes up on the whiteboard, and the eraser is erasing the Conservative legacy of the last 10 years.
If you do worry about the deficit, not only the year-to-year deficit, but the promise that it would be balanced by the end of the mandate, that according to today's budget is not going to happen, do you think they can sell it based on the answer we just heard Bill Morneau give? Chantal?
I think they prepared the ground well. I think they have enough support in economic circles to sell it. I think it's a major fault in the budget that it does not actually come up with a timeline for restoring fiscal balance. And the trouble is not going to be over this year's deficit. It's going to be over this kind of open-endedness that I think will come as a surprise to many, including people who support the general direction of the budget.
Yeah, he seems to be pointing into the early years of the next mandate, if they were to get one, before balance would be reached. Jennifer, on this?
Yeah, I agree with Chantal. It's going to be very difficult to sell that part of it. But I have my suspicions by the time we get closer to the next election that somehow things will miraculously tighten up. But I think people are largely getting what they paid for, so to speak, if they voted Liberal. And also the overarching message, I think, of this particular budget is about income inequality. And so I think a lot of Canadians who see the top 0.01% increasing their incomes by 160% over the last 30 years, and their income's only increasing about 2%, I think people can understand that concept, and that's what this whole budget is really about, is reducing income inequality.
Andrew?
Well, for the last 20 years, median incomes have actually been rising after inflation. What happened 30 years ago is 30 years ago. Inequality
I agree. I disagree
inequality
on
is
that.
actually being reduced right now. The top 1% has gone down over the last 10 years. But look, the main focus has always been, in their rhetoric, has been this is not your father's deficit. This is a growth-oriented deficit. Well, it's, as I say, if you look at what they're actually spending the money on, the new Canada Child Benefit may be a wonderful thing, but that's not growth. That's not investment. Opening employment insurance more, making it more open-ended, that's maybe a useful thing in the current circumstances, but that's not going to buy more growth. The actual investments in infrastructure are maybe a quarter by the very loose definition the Liberals use of infrastructure. So it's not really a growth-oriented deficit. It's not one that's born of necessity. It's just one that they chose to do because they'd like to spend more money than they're taking in taxes.
That's easy to say, but the other choice would have been to say we are going to not fulfill a single one of our promises because the deficit is at 18 billion. I don't think that would have washed with most voters who supported the Liberals and probably with many other voters. But those were the options. We forego all of our campaign promises and make cuts, or we do what we do today.
All right, let me just set the deficit issue aside for a moment and ask this question, because there was a lot of talk leading up to this. This was going to be a changed budget, that it would change the way the Canadian economy works. Does that happen in this budget as a result of this budget? You're shaking your head, Andrew?
We have a $2 trillion economy. Moving a couple $1 billion to the cities to pay for transit isn't even going to solve the traffic problem, let alone, transform the economy. there's an absolute issue out there, not about what median incomes did in the past, but what's going to happen in the future because of the aging of the population. The finance minister properly references that. But if they were serious about that, what you need to do is to be mobilizing everybody in the economy, businesses large and small across the economy, not just spending a few $billion in infrastructure. You need to be doing things like reducing tax rates and investment. You need to be opening sectors that are protected from competition to competition. All the direction they're going in is centralizing more resources under government control and less to the kind of broadly more competitive economy that we need to really get the kind of productivity increases we're going to need in the years to come.
Jennifer?
Well, I think that Andrew is showing that there's a great divergence in philosophy around the budget. I know conservatives are probably up in arms across the country, but I just take issue with one thing that he said. Giving money to families with children, that could be, theoretically, it could be a way of changing the economy over time. If you help the lowest income Canadians reach their potential, go to university and so on. I mean, there's a whole debate over whether giving richer people money so they can continue going to university, whether that really grows your economy over time. But if you're giving money to the lower income Canadians, that could actually have a more long-lasting benefit. It's just the problem is we're not going to know that in 4 or 5 years. It's going to be a longer-term project.
Chantal?
I'm not going to write off this budget that's just sprinkling money on various groups with no results. I think there are in there social investments and infrastructure investments that are important, essential, and that will pay off. But like Andrew, I agree on one thing. A budget will not transform the Canadian economy. That is not how this works.
You know, often on days like this, we look for something in the wording that surprises us, or that there's a surprise buried in there. I'm not sure anybody has found one quite yet, but I'm sure there are certain things that struck each of you differently. Jennifer, what struck you in this?
Well, one is that how many programs and initiatives of the Conservatives that they are just doing away with or reversing. So they're bringing back the Court Challenges program. They're restoring the Kitsilano Coast Guard facility. I mean, there's a long list. I wrote it out, and it was very, very long. But also, I was struck by just the content of the budget plan. There's a whole chapter on Indigenous affairs, a whole chapter on the environment. And that's a real, I think, change from the previous government. 3 years ago, the budget speech didn't include one mention of the word environment. So you can see how there is a real sea change in the approach. That's really, I think, what stuck out for me.
Andrew?
Well, I'll take the opposite tack. The continuities, I think, that struck me with the previous government in two respects. One is transfers to the provinces, where there'd been a lot of talk about a new health accord. Maybe that's yet to come, but if the budget that's laying out for the next few years has more or less the same numbers for the transfers to the provinces as the Harper government laid out. And similarly, if you look at the government's own operating expenses, to pay for, in effect, to pay for the increases that they want to make in transfers to individuals and transfers to organizations like universities, they have to keep operating expenses basically flatlined for several years. That is going to be a very interesting challenge, particularly when they come up with negotiations with the public sector unions.
Chantal?
The very large place that cities and big cities have in the subtext of this budget versus provinces and provincial finance ministers who are probably poring over this, trying to find the money that's coming to them, while the big city mayors, I think, are dancing in their offices tonight thinking, we've finally found Santa Claus and he's Justin Trudeau.
You know, I can't remember the last time, if there was one, certainly in the modern era, of a finance minister with no previous cabinet experience at any government level coming in that portfolio, giving his first budget. Given that as a background, Chantal's already thought of one.
Apparently 1919, but I can't tell you who that was.
Yes, for me, that is the modern era. No, but given all that, how do you rate, and this, we've got to be quick from each of you, Bill Morneau on his first budget. Jennifer?
Well, he stuck to his talking points, as you probably could tell, over and over. So if that's rating the minister, I guess, well, he scored an A on talking points.
All right, Chantal?
He's not going to sell that budget. The budget is going to have to sell itself. Those talking points do not do the kind of in-depth job that you normally expect for a better communicator.
Last word, Andrew.
Well, that's the problem. I think a big part of the finance minister's job is to communicate. A big part of Paul Martin's success was he was able to kind of rally the public and say, this is where we have to go. Mr. Morneau may have many strengths, but I think we're seeing in the early going, at any rate, communications is not one of them.
All right, we'll leave it at that for tonight. Andrew and Chantal in Ottawa, and Jennifer, great of you to join us from Ottawa as well tonight.
Thank you.